Hi there, my name is Nick Mays. For the last 40 years, I've immersed myself in the classical tradition. I studied Greek and Latin. I did a doctorate on the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I taught off and on at the university for some 15 years. At the same time, I've taught history on the high school level for some 20 years. Canadian history, American history, modern Western history, and ancient history. I also happen to be a secular Jew. Now, I mention this personal information only because for the last 30 years, I've had this sneaking suspicion that the cornerstones of my identity are wearing very thin in the public square. We don't read history nearly as much as nowadays as we did in the past. The classical tradition is all but dead. It would be a miracle if people read these things in translation, let alone the original languages. And as far as secular Judaism goes, give it another 2 generations, and Jews like me will be absolutely gone. I imagine that you feel the same way. I imagine that when you consider the texts that you read, Charles Dickens or J.K. Rowling, you understand that these are texts that younger people no longer have any interest in whatsoever. Or the music you listen to. It could be Beethoven, it could be the Rolling Stones, it could be Madonna. This too has faded from the public square. And when you walk by the church that perhaps you were baptized in or your father was baptized in, you see that it's been turned into condominiums. All of this is very confusing, and all of this has led me to question exactly what is modernity about, because modernity is the force that is responsible for all of this change. Over the next 6 lectures, I would like to get to the very heart of this question. I'd like to ask, what is modernity, of course, and at the same time, how far is it going to take us, and in what direction is it steering us? Is it boundless? Does it just go on without limit? Or does it come to some type of end? How are we to survive it? That perhaps is the crucial question. Is there a rule book that we can come up with that will allow us at least to make some sense of this phenomenon? These are all very intriguing, vast questions, but deeply, deeply fascinating ones. So please join me over these next 6 lectures to look at this vast but fascinating topic. In fact, why don't we get to start right now with the basic foundations? All right, let's get started. So how is it that this idea of modernity really started to intrigue me? Some years ago, my wife and I were hiking in Kyrgyzstan, and as often happens when you're hiking in the far country, we stayed in a hiker's hut. There were a number of people who joined us in this hut, Westerners for the most part, and we had these great conversations each night around the supper table. And on one occasion, a Dutchman told us of his marvelous adventure that day. He had, in actual fact, encountered a local Kyrgyz girl, a Muslim Kyrgyz girl, and on talking to her, he was so much struck by how authentic she was, how rooted she was, how complete she was. And he went on and on and on about this and concluded that if he were to come back 10 or 15 years later, and he said this on a bitter note, he would probably discover that a McDonald's had invaded her village and other signs of our so-called progress. I have to say I couldn't really let things go. I found this just a little perturbing. I asked this Dutchman whether he thought that the woman was necessarily happy about the idea that she had to attend the mosque 3, 5 times a day to pray, whether her parents were, were entitled to arrange her marriage, as they often do in that country, whether she was happy with the fact that she might never leave that locale in the way that the Dutchman was able to travel to Kyrgyzstan. Maybe she really envied him his freedom. Wasn't that possible? I asked him. At the same time, I asked if he would want to go back to his roots. That is to say, would he want to be a farmer as his Dutch forebears had been? Would he perhaps want to go to their very strict Dutch reformist church and at the same time walk around, not in his Adidas, but in these heavy wooden clogs? The Dutchman heard all of this and he agreed I was making some very good points, but I don't think I convinced him entirely. Then there's my father-in-law. My father-in-law was born in the former Soviet Union when Stalin was still in control. In fact, this was during the Second World War. He grew up with hunger, fear, cold, everything unimaginable, really. And finally, he was able to escape to Canada in 1948, where he has lived ever since. The only problem is that in conversations with him, he very often complains about the fact that we in Canada here have lost our way, so he would describe it. We no longer have children. We no longer read our classical Western canon. And then our popular culture, as far as he's concerned, is vulgar, decadent, self-loathing, etc., etc. Now, I think he's absolutely making a point that is very profound. But at the same time, I often ask him if perhaps the very silly nature of our culture and its self-loathing dimensions are perhaps a tax you pay when you live in a society that has been able to escape the horrible isms that he grew up with in his youth, Nazism, communism, and the like. Again, my father-in-law has always said that I'm making a pretty good point, but at the same time, I haven't got him fully persuaded. Then there are my students. I have taught a course on modern Western history for a very long time, and very often I notice my students are highly unenthusiastic about this topic, mainly because they really think that modern Western history is a record of genocide, slavery, pogroms, and the like. And of course, the genocide of the natives, the pogroms of the Jews, and the enslavement of the black population. And I often tell them that they're absolutely right, that our record, our record really is full of such terrible, terrible events. But I ask them, is that all there is to it? Is it possible that perhaps we are living in better times? That perhaps, right, they themselves as Jews have greater freedom, and black people have greater freedom, and women have greater freedom, and indigenous people have greater freedom. They refuse to accept this. They point to the recent murder of George Floyd as proof that we are still caught in the same cycle as we were before. And very often they'll also turn to the recent rescission of Roe versus Wade, saying once again, women too are really just the playthings of males, white males for that matter. So once again, I'm not really able to persuade them. I do sometimes ask them, is there a time or place that they could imagine themselves living that would be preferable to the modern age? Would they want to be somewhat like the young people of the 1960s who tried to flee from the Eisenhower age and its seeming formal restrictions to leave behind the military industrial complex and the like, and create a life for themselves that was now much more free and innocent and somehow an escape from our modern norms. And they don't want to do that at all. That's something that they clearly they're not interested. They don't want to leave the modern, but at the same time they don't like the modern. And it's certainly true of these young people too. Every picture here you see of these individuals who tried to leave modernity behind to set up something more idyllic, primitive but idyllic for themselves, all of these societies failed comprehensively. So it's very peculiar. What are we to make of the modern? We detest it, but at the same time we don't want to live in any other set of circumstances. And the question is, what is modernity? Does it steal up upon us slowly, or did it come upon us all at once? Does it give us gains? And are these gains very substantial? Or does it cause losses that to a very significant degree outweigh the gains? Does modernity change us? Are we essentially the same person in the modern age as someone in the 13th century was, only perhaps we use cologne and we get about in cars rather than on foot or on horse? Or are we truly, truly different? Have we become almost, well, not quite a different species, but something like that, a completely different consciousness? Is that possible? Should modernity be feared? Is it something that we should really be very, very leery of? And can we escape it? Can we circle the wagons and somehow prevent modernity from encroaching on us any further? All of these are truly fascinating questions that have teased my imagination now for quite some time. Now, I am treading on ground that other people have walked on. In the 19th century, we have commentators like Marx and Weber, followed by Marcuse, who felt that modernity was really represented capitalism, the encroachments of capitalism. And they felt that this was just absolutely obscene, that capitalism was just going to sell out every aspect of society. Nietzsche felt that modernity was, in a sense, going to restrict human beings from achieving massive accomplishments according to their ambition, that we would become so comfortable and so pliant and so desensitized and anesthetized that there would be no room for any human greatness any longer. Alan Bloom, writing some decades ago, felt that modernity was robbing us of the glories of the Western canon. And then authors like Ronald Wright and Jared Diamond have written to great effect on how modernity has brought us on the precipice of a great environmental disaster. Then there are the people who really like modernity. There are 19th century scholars like John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer, and they were followed by John Rawls. And the feeling of these three thinkers essentially is that once you hit this modern, liberal, humanistic society of ours, things start spiraling upward. You gain greater health, greater freedom, greater wealth, greater security of person, and therefore modernity is a very good thing. Authors like Ridley, Steven Pinker, and Norberg argue that our material gains over the last few decades have been so substantial that how could anyone possibly find fault with modernity? And then there's Bjorn Lomborg, who takes a strip out of the arguments of the environmentalists, Ronald Wright and Jared Diamond and others, and he makes the argument that ultimately we will be able to curb our environmental excesses through technological fixes. He doesn't deny that there's a problem with climate change. He just feels it's something that we can address through our own intellectual and technological gains. And then there's Ray Kurzweil, who wrote in his Singularity is Near, described a world coming upon us very soon in which we will, in a sense, cohabit with AI. We will increase our AI by millions of points, our IQ by millions of points, our longevity by an astounding period of time, our means of production will be off the scale, and so on and so forth. He sees the modern era coming as one that is going to open up these incalculable riches for humankind. What about my argument? I mean, we've seen both sides of the equation very ably represented by these thinkers. Where do I differ from them? Number one, of course, I feel that the changes have been very substantial. At the same time, I also believe, along the lines of a Steven Pinker, that the gains far exceed the losses. But at the same time, I feel that the gains have come about because of the losses. And this is what, in a sense, this is why modernity really gives us pause, because you can only have these gains when really genuine treasures are pushed to one side. I think as well that one can be dangerously nostalgic. This is the problem, I think, with the people who are opposed to modernity. If you are unduly nostalgic, then you tend to concentrate on the losses that we've made, which do have to be given their full merit. And you see the world, and the modern world that is, as essentially being half empty. At the same time, if you are unduly nostalgic, I think it pushes the way we think of the world and the way we think of how we ought to adapt to these modern encroachments. I think it pushes us into a dead end. In other words, ultimately, what I'm arguing here is that once we recognize, and this is a cardinal point of view, that modernity has really means gains at a terrible cost to ourselves, but still the gains are palpably greater than the losses. This is where the equation becomes a very interesting one, as shall become clear as I continue with this argument. I also bring to the table this notion that we have rewired ourselves, that when we think of modernity and its changes on us, it really means to some degree a change of consciousness. More about that too. All right, what my argument is going to unfold as follows. First off, we need definitions of history and modernity itself. I've gone some direction in defining what modernity is, but let's be a little more thorough, and I'm going to do that in just a moment. The second component of my argument is that we really, truly have changed, that our consciousness has changed. It's not just that we have better technology, we are a different critter. My third argument is that we we have to we have to come up with the proper means of judging the past. If modernity is a product of the past, and modernity is ultimately a very good thing, how is it that we can actually have such a good thing emerging from a past which, according to my students, is just a repository of genocide and pogroms and exploitation and slavery and so on and so forth. So when can we judge the past? That too is a very important aspect to this argument that we'll be looking into. I also want to concentrate on what we have lost. We have truly, truly lost enormous treasures as we moved into the modern, and these losses were probably necessary. We couldn't have the gains we have today unless we actually had extraordinary losses, right, left behind in the dust behind us. And another and very difficult and challenging aspect of this argument is the notion of assimilation. We are not, right, when we speak of assimilation, it is not as though one population, white people, are expecting other people to assimilate to white people's ways. Instead, just as the white population, the Western population, has assimilated to the modern at a tremendous cost to itself, so similarly down the road, non-Western populations, non-white populations, are going to have to assimilate to the modern too, with equally staggering losses that amass. That's just the nature of the beast. Everybody is assimilating to the modern. Finally, what happens if we choose to circle our wagons and ignore the modern? Is it possible to do so? I think, in a word, it is not. Ultimately, the modern will exact its dues. These are the arguments I'm going to bring to the table. We're going to look at them in some detail. Let's start off with the very first one. Well, actually, why don't we back up for a moment? Why is this argument so important now? Why now? Why do we have to understand the modern at this particular moment? I think we're living in very troubled times because our post-World War II assumptions have run out of steam. At the end of the Second World War, it was understood that Europe would have to have peace. After two devastating wars, Europeans would have to shelve certain traditional components of themselves, and they did. They actually shelved their nationalistic spirits, witness the creation of the EU. They shelved their formal colonial aspirations. They just got rid of their empires. And suddenly these ex-colonial subjects could enjoy their own autonomy. At the same time, they created these extraordinary social programs that would raise their citizens from cradle to grave. At the same time, they had the development of their technology. They changed their immigration practices. Up until this time, generally speaking, people emigrating to the West were people who were coming from the West. You'd have Germans coming to Canada. You'd have Canadians going to Germany. Now it was understood we're going to open our borders to everyone. Anyone can come and live within our Western territories. At the same time, the United States stood as a guarantor of this new order. They were willing to spend money, blood, and treasure in a way that they hadn't in the past. They abandoned their isolationist stance, and they became the superpower that was going to keep this new liberal order afloat. The only problem is that after 75 years of this marvelous experiment, the West is saddled with debt. And at the same time, our technology, far from just freeing us, it seems to be coming close to enslaving us. Perhaps that move from the rotary phone of my youth to the iPhone of today is bringing many more problems in its wake than we ever imagined. At the same time, we had these great notions of civil rights kicking into play. We have the UN's Declaration of Universal Human Rights. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, changes to all of the European charters that finally said everyone was the equal of everyone else, that women and minorities and homosexuals would enjoy the exact same type of influence and the same freedoms as the traditional male white, no heterosexual white. All of that was put into place, but unfortunately, many critics feel today that these civil rights are a bit of a sham. Witness the rescission of Roe versus Wade in recent days. So we're at a bit of an impasse. We seem to have brought all of these enormously important correctives to the old way of doing business into play, and they seem to be running out of gas. And I think we think they're running out of gas because we don't quite understand what it is modernity is exacting of us, what it is demanding of us. And at the end of these lectures, I'm hoping this will come into focus and we'll understand perhaps that we have less to worry about than perhaps really is the case. All right, let's start with a definition of history. So what is history? In order to understand what history is, perhaps we can just start off with this marvelous scene in the 8th season of Game of Thrones, a scene in which Jon Snow is celebrating because he performed very ably in a battle in which humankind was able to hold its own, and he's being praised for his efforts. The only problem being Daenerys is sitting in the background, is hearing Jon Snow being praised in this fashion and is wondering whether he's going to step on her own power ambitions. So this is a scene of immense drama and tension. The only problem being, oh, hang on a second. What's going on here? We have a Starbucks cup intruding on this particular vignette. What's going on here? Why is it that anachronisms are so troubling? Why should it bother us so much that a Starbucks cup appeared on this set? I think it's because we understand that a cup isn't just a cup, it's everything that we associate with it. That is to say, if that Starbucks cup really made sense on that set, right? Let's just take a look at it again. If it really made sense in this context, how is it that these men would be wearing leathers? How is it that they'd be carrying swords and riding about on horseback? Because the proper context for a Starbucks cup is one in which people are driving cars to get to a cafe, right? On their way to work where they have computers, or on their way to school where there are universities that enable them to study sciences like chemistry so they can produce the plastic inherent in this cup. And of course, all of this is being run by governmental systems that operate on parliamentarian philosophies and not being run by the feudal goons of the Game of Thrones brand. So this cup, in other words, is overturning what history is. It is too much of an intrusion on the set here because it overturns every single aspect of what Game of Thrones stands for. This medieval realm in which you have brute power and muscle-wielded weapons and so on and so forth. So this raises a very interesting question. What is history? When I'm saying that an anachronism can overturn history, what is it overturning? Well, why don't we just concentrate on this for a short while? One way of understanding what history is to start with the definition that Collingwood offers in his magisterial work, The Idea of History. He says right at the introduction, history is a kind of science, an organized body of knowledge that studies past actions through the interpretation of evidence to understand our humanity more deeply. A perfectly serviceable definition. The problem is that it doesn't really capture, as Collingwood himself is well aware, it doesn't capture some of the peculiarities of history. To illustrate this, let's just consider a very famous scene from history. We have Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE. This marks the onset of his rebellion against the Roman Empire, and in a sense, his challenging of the traditional power structure, and it's going to lead to the Roman Revolution, in which ultimately you have the Republic overthrown and a new emperor-based type of government being put into place. The question is how do we know that he crossed the river? I mean, it happened 2,000 years ago, so how do we know? Well, we know because Suetonius and Plutarch, historians both, told us that he crossed the river. The only problem there, however, is that both Suetonius and Plutarch lived approximately 100 years after Caesar did. So how did they know that he crossed the river? Well, they spoke to people who saw Caesar cross the river or heard from a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy that Caesar crossed the river, you can see already that there's a real problem here with respect to the authenticity of this, or the reliability of this information. At the same time, you wonder, are Plutarch and Suetonius, are they talking about this event in its own right, or are they seeing it from their own perspective? That is to say, are they talking about this event because it happened 100 years before their own lifetime? Or are they thinking, well, we live in the era of emperors and Julius Caesar caused that era to come about, and that's why we're talking about this. Not because we're seeing it through his eyes as it unfolded, but instead we're seeing it through our eyes and what it led to. In a similar vein, just to use an analogy here, when you think of Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, ostensibly it's taking place in 17th century America during the time of the Salem witch trials, but that's not what really interests him. What really interests him, and let me just give you a good shot of what's going on here, what really interests him is the McCarthy trials that were taking place in the United States at that stage. The persecution of people who were just accused of being communists, and the accusation of communism was enough to get you in trouble. So is that how history is actually being described, right? From the present, using the past to explain the present. That might be a little problematic. So what is history? I mean, if we're going to use Collingwood's definition, we're going to come across many, many troubling issues that stand in our way of how history operates. So what I would like to do is I would like to propose a different idea of history, or at least a parallel idea of history. And that is that history studies change. It studies change. There is no point writing the history of a population if that population doesn't change in any way whatsoever. I mean, just imagine for a period of 500 years, you're looking at population X, and X dresses the same way, has the exact same type of government, the exact same political circumstances, the exact same economic circumstances, no technological changes whatsoever. The only difference is that some people are alive 300-400 years, ahead of the time when we first started studying this population, and others have died. Right? That's not change, and history would not be interested in that population at all. So in order to have history, you have to have change. But then the question is how does change come about? History tries to understand the mechanisms behind change. And this is where we get to the idea of interconnectivity. History understands, if you're doing history, you understand that no event, no idea, no action takes place unless it has been affected by a multitude of factors present in that day and age. You can't have a change in the fashions unless perhaps new materials and new fashions have been brought to that area through trade, or through a new sense of fashion has been brought about through a highly influential figure or someone using his imagination. And that would depend upon more money in people's pockets to buy that new fashion, which means there's been a change to the economy. And then, of course, the change to the economy may have come about because there was a lessening of the restrictions of the religion of the day, which came about because you suddenly have a new type of ruler on hand, or a new set of ideas in circulation. It just goes on and on and on and on. Change comes about through these interconnected facets that exist at any given stage within a society's development. In other words, when we look at a society, you can't move one piece on the chessboard without affecting all the pieces at once. The configuration changes entirely with the move of just one single piece. So as an illustration of this, why don't we try and very briefly look at an attempt to explain the causation of the First World War. Let's say that's what you wanted to do. I want to explain how World War I broke out. Well, of course, you'd have to explain the alliance system of the day, the fact that England and France and Russia came together on one side, and Austria-Hungary and Germany and Italy came together on the other side. But you'd then have to understand that this was probably due to the fact that you had something called the Franco-Prussian War, breaking out in 1870, in which France was defeated by Germany. This led to the unification of Germany, which until that time had consisted of a multitude of separate states. And this altered significantly the power balance within all of Western Europe as a whole. You suddenly had this divided population crystallizing into one national identity with extraordinary consequences for everyone. This led to an attempt on the part of the French to somehow undo the effects of their defeat through the course of the Franco-Prussian War in developing massive amounts of technology, Maxim guns and artillery pieces and the like, right? Even as you had a man by the name of Mahan, an American officer, writing a book that argued there was no such thing as imperial power unless a very, very powerful land-based power developed a navy. This book triggered the imagination of Kaiser Wilhelm, the man you see in the lower left side. It triggered his imagination, and suddenly he started building ships at a massive rate. And this, of course, upset the British, whose entire defense network, as well as their imperial ambitions, were really dependent upon their navy and dependent upon the fact that they were the leading naval power at large. You'd also have to talk about such things as national aspirations, the role of religion, the type of the newspapers in play and the way in which people communicated with each other. The list would go on and on and on and on, culminating, of course, with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in this backward European capital, much to the surprise of everyone, at which point many of these dominoes started tumbling in on one another. In other words, in order to explain the cause of this war, you would have to take a look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of intersecting factors, interconnected factors. Another, perhaps more trivial example would be trying to explain the popularity of Frank Sinatra in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. How is it that this man, right, it's, of course, given that he was massively talented, but how is it that this man became the idol of America, the crooner of America in his own day and age? You'd have to understand such things as the Italian-American immigrant experience. Of course, you would have to, let me just step away again, you'd have to understand the onset of this music and its domination of the popular imagination, jazz, right? How this came about in the 20s and just took America by storm. You would have to understand the nature of radio and, more importantly, the record business and how it caused Frank Sinatra to become a voice that was heard in every living room within America. You'd have to understand post-war prosperity to understand that set of admirers of Frank Sinatra, the young teenage, female teenage set, the Bobby Sox as they were called, how it was that they came to admire him. And I say prosperity because they had to buy his records, they had to have the money to buy his records as a way of understanding who he was. All of these are factors that you would really have to bring into play, as well as perhaps post-World War I male styles of fashion, the Marine look, the very well clean cut look, which was still left over from the military days of the Second World War. All of these factors and many, many others would have to be brought together in order to explain why this man came to prominence. Another way of looking at this whole idea of history as interconnectivity, that is to say, all these elements coming together to push events forward, we can understand this by looking at objects, singular objects, and seeing how they bring so many different elements together. They unify these elements or crystallize these elements. One such object would be a simple pair of jeans. So if you look at this picture here, this is a game taking place, a football game at Harvard, taking place circa 2022, 2023. What's so interesting about this picture is that you have men and women wearing the same clothes. I mean, to us, this is not a big deal at all, but to anyone living, let's say, prior to 1950, this is a very, very big deal indeed. The women and the men are wearing jeans, and these people are very well heeled. After all, they are at Harvard, their children are at Harvard, they themselves are upper middle class, earning very, very good money, and yet they're wearing these jeans. Why is that so peculiar? Well, the jean itself, you'll recall, was really the clothing of the working class in the middle of the 19th century. It was really designed for farmhands and cowboys by Levi Strauss, and that's who wore it. Anyone else wearing it in the 1860s, 1870s would have considered to be somehow dressing up to be a worker, a common worker. Eventually in the 1950s, especially through the movie Rebel Without a Cause by James Dean, he wore these jeans And this really crystallized an appreciation for this item of dress. Suddenly you had huge numbers of people from the middle class who prior to then would not have been caught dead wearing this pair of pants, this type of dress. They suddenly are enamored with it. And then when you move into the 60s and the protests against the government because of the civil rights struggle, as well as Vietnam, many college students, that is to say people going to Harvard and coming from the middle class, were more than happy to wear this item of dress as, in a sense, a symbol of their new progressive politics. And from there, it was a hop, skip, and a jump for women to wear this, minorities to wear this, young and old to wear this, everyone to wear this, right? This is a new form of dress that, in a sense, represents the egalitarian spirit at large in our modern age. Right? So when you see these genes in a modern society, you realize, wow, that really represents the open-endedness of society, so that black and white can't be distinguished from each other any longer. Male and female can't be distinguished from each other any longer. Young and poor, and so on and so forth. Another object that is just, in a sense, rife with implications is this credit card from the United Arab Emirates. If you didn't know anything else about that country, you would realize, well, they're very much in tune with our international banking system. Right? Of course, you would also realize that any society that has actually produced a card of this nature, its plastic, its microchip, its magnetic strip on the back, and so on and so forth, that it is highly advanced. It's a very advanced society. You would also understand that any country using a card of this nature, it has an economy that is tied in with the global economy as a whole, and it's encouraging the borrowing of money. It's encouraging debt, right? So, and this is taking place over a very wide area, so you understand the people who are actually using such a card are in actual fact part of a system that is prone to perhaps global economic meltdowns. If you really examine this card very closely, you would also notice that there is tooling on it. You can't really see it here, but there's tooling on this card that indicates it is compliant with Sharia debt practices, so that the modern world in some ways is trying to accommodate older attitudes with respect to debt as a way of making this card usable for that part of the population. And then, of course, there's our smartphone, right? A smartphone instantly indicates that any society using it with full open access to all of its different features, that this is a society that is open-ended, that is open to exchanges of ideas, to new forms of finance, to information that might be destabilizing, to criticisms of leaders and the like. Right? So this too, this simple object, when you see a population with an object of this nature, you right away you can read so many different intersecting aspects into that culture because of this one object. Right? This is why, once again, that Starbucks cup on the Game of Thrones setting was so problematic. It brings to the table a series of interconnected assumptions associated with that cup. The manufacturing prowess, commercial practices, legal practices, educational practices that are out of keeping with the Game of Thrones brand. All right, we can also see another example of this interconnectivity in reverse when we see people in a way that's similar to the intrusion of a Starbucks cup on the Game of Thrones setting, when artists move one piece on the chessboard, but not all of them. In these postcards here, an artist by the name of Jean-Paul Coté came up with this imaginary view of what France would look like 100 years after the point when he was actually making these drawings. So he was making these drawings in the year 1900, a year of great optimism. He was thinking, so what will France look like 100 years down the road in the year 2000? Hence the title of these postcards, En l'an 2000, in the year 2000. And we can see that Coté gets some stuff here really right. I mean, daringly right. In that book, in this picture here, we see these young boys learning through electronic impulses that are being pumped directly into their brains. Right? This is almost like Kurzweil's idea of how we're going to learn down the road. Or it's a bit like the Matrix, where Neo can suddenly fight like a kung fu master because the information has been directly pumped into his brain. So this is very daring. The only problem is that, well, being hopeless, no, just remarkably imaginative, it is also hopelessly off. We see that the room in which this is taking place is very 19th century. The desks are 19th century. The dress of the boys is 19th century. The fact that they're all white is very 19th century. The fact that they're all male is very 19th century. The fact that this machine, and let me just step aside here, is being hand cranked, that too is 19th century. And then you have to ask yourself what sort of texts are being pumped into this machine. They too are also 19th century as well. A history of France, Virgil, Homer, and so on and so forth. Right? Cote got something desperately wrong here. He doesn't understand that once he pushed the technology forward, everything else would move with it. You would not have anything, you would not have a classroom that was anything like this one here. Similarly, in this scene, we see that there's this young maidservant who is cleaning a house using this marvelous automatic device. She doesn't have to get down on her hands and knees. Now she can get the device to do it. But at the same time, we see this is just one piece on the chessboard that has been pushed forward. We still have a servant class. Why would you have a servant class if you actually have these mechanical devices on hand? We see that that servant is white because at this stage, Cote just couldn't imagine that France would become so much more multi-ethnic over the next 100 years. We see that there's art on the wall, but guess what? It's 19th century art. It isn't anything like an Andy Warhol or any of the other masters of the 20th and 21st century. We see too that there's a piano. What songs will be played on the piano? Very likely the hits of the day, or perhaps some Bach or Brahms. No Taylor Swift, not in this day and age. And if you were to leave this context, if you were to walk outside this apartment, no doubt Cote would think that France is still an imperial power. We can also get this idea of interconnectivity. That is to say, the idea that you have many, many intersecting factors that push events forward. We can see this in reverse when we imagine a catastrophe coming about. So imagine that there is some type of nuclear strike or a plague or whatever. In a context like that, every single aspect of society would be badly affected. If the grid went out, it's not as though people would now just get by in the dark. We understand that our clean water drinking would fail, our security would fail, policemen and firemen and the like would just dissipate, that a respect for law and order would fail, that we wouldn't have our work any longer, we wouldn't be manufacturing goods any longer, we would be poor, and the world would now belong not to the patent lawyer or to the software engineer, but to the muscular brute who could get by with his muscles alone. Right? So we see once again in reverse that just as we move forward, when we have all these different factors coming together, when something very significant comes about that is highly, highly disruptive to our way of life, then we see that many of these different factors are actually done away with. All right, so much for history. What about modernity? Well, why don't we start with a single toss-off phrase on what modernity consists of. So I wrote here, a state of being premised on limitless change to further our material gains and personal freedoms over as broad a tract as possible. Notice how I say state of being. Right? Being modern means that you are open to the idea that there is going to be limitless change in every possible way, and that your freedoms are going to become larger and larger, although they may also be subtracted in some ways, as we'll see. And this will happen not just in your locale, but it will spread over as broad an area as possible. All right, that's a very useful definition, but let's try and drill a little deeper than this. Why don't we imagine the following? If we really want to get to a notion of what the modern is, why don't we imagine a scenario in which a 17th century English gentleman of the middle class, John Aubrey, for example, he is time transported to modern day Manhattan. So why John Aubrey? Well, he's coming from an age where you see some glints of the modern, and he himself was very educated. In fact, he's known for Aubrey's brief lives, these brief biographical sketches of people like Shakespeare and Thomas Hobbes and Sir Walter Raleigh and the like. And it's just interesting. The question that we should really raise is, what would he think of our world? Because of course, as soon as he came into modern Manhattan, He would just be bowled over by the Manhattan skyline. He would just be flabbergasted that you could pack so many people into such a small area. He would be overwhelmed by our means of transportation, these vehicles that somehow move on their own. He would be flabbergasted by our electrical grid that powers our different city structures. And of course, he would be amazed by our various multicultural populations, Asians and Jews and Muslims and Sikhs, all living together in this very, very crowded space. This would dazzle him. At the same time, as a few months went by, he would begin to realize that some aspects of this modern world were very much like his own world. So he drew water from a pump, we draw water from a faucet. Big deal, right? The pub, he went to a pub and he got beer. We can go to a pub too, and we can get 50 different types of beer, but big deal, the idea is the same. His own age had wagons that were drawn by oxen and horses. We have trucks, but the principle itself is fairly understandable. And then, of course, his own age had hospitals, very dirty, smelly, primitive places to be sure. And we have hospitals that are hygienic and highly advanced. But at the same time, the idea itself isn't so foreign to him. So what is the modern? Well, there are elements to the modern. There are elements to the modern that would take John Aubrey aback. He could stay in Manhattan for years, and there's certain things he simply could not get used to. And it's these elements that he couldn't get used to, even if he were there for the rest of his life, that really define what the modern is. And one such element is the invisible. The invisible. What do I mean by the invisible? Well, if John Aubrey were to go back to his own day and age in the 17th century, and you were to ask him, how is your food made? How are your clothes made? How is your house constructed? He would know every element of this. It's not as though he himself would be able to do this, but he would be able to explain to you in principle how the food got grown and how it was milled and how it was baked, right? How bricks were made, how metals were mined and smelted and shaped by the blacksmith, how fibers were drawn together and woven together. All of this would be fully understandable to him. He wouldn't have the skills, but he would have the understanding of it. He could be, in principle, what we call a universal man, where every element around him, every man-made element around him, is something that he has a distinct awareness and knowledge of. The problem is, in our world, it isn't like that at all. Our basic elements are highly invisible. So if you look at that image on the top left, what is that? Well, it turns out to be a cesium atomic clock. That is how we keep time, to an accuracy of a millionth of a second lost each year. That is an extraordinary degree of accuracy, and we need this type of accuracy if we're going to run our GPS. But if you ask me, well, can you tell me anything more about the cesium atomic clock? No, I can't. That is everything I know, and that's probably everything most other people know about this clock, because it's too sophisticated for any one person to know about, unless that person is an absolute specialist in this area. What about that object to the top right? That is a fiber optics cable that we lay on the ocean floor to further our modern day communications. How do they make fiber optics? I don't know. How is the signal sent? How do you convey information on a light signal and then send it thousands of miles across the world? I have no idea. What is the material made of that overall cluster is embedded in, so that the salt of the sea won't wear it away? I couldn't tell you. I have no idea what it is, and I don't know how they manufacture it. All of this is a mystery to me as I open up my smartphone and I call my brother over in Europe. What about that object behind me, the microchip here? Right? When we see this, when we see something of that nature, we become very, very nervous, because we realize we're straying into a part of our laptop or our cell phone that we really shouldn't be looking at. How do they manufacture these chips on such a reduced scale? I don't know. And that's true of 99.99% of people at large. And then something even basic as this new currency, Bitcoin, right? What is it? How does it operate? How does it function? Will it really work well or not? Even high-priced financiers are not quite sure about this. right? And if they don't know, how can I know? In other words, when you look at these different elements here, perhaps you'd find 1 in 1,000 people who could explain just one element here, but they couldn't explain them all. And what's true of these elements of our modern world is true of so many others. Our world, the basic operations of our world are invisible to us. In other words, another facet of our world that would really take John Aubrey by surprise is the fact that we have to trust people so much. Because I don't know how my food has been produced. I don't know whether it's sound or not. I don't know whether some type of pharmaceutical will really help me out or not. I don't know what's going wrong with my body when my heartbeat is off or I have a headache. I rely upon an expert to tell me this and to come up with the right medication. I don't know if my plane is going to land. Right? If the landing gear is going to come out and the plane itself isn't going to smash into a million little pieces. I just don't know. I just expect that things will work out well. I trust that it will work out well because they're experts looking after this. And that's yet another component of our modern world. We have these experts who actually get credentials and diplomas and degrees of one type or another granted by different institutions that tell them they are experts in this area and inform me that they're experts in this area so that I can trust what they do. But again, this credentialism is something that would really take John Aubrey aback. That wasn't true of his day and age. A farmer could farm without having a degree. A blacksmith could be a blacksmith without having a degree. Right? Today, it's not nearly as easy as that. And of course, if you're going to have this extensive network of institutions that grant these different diplomas that enable me to trust experts in this invisible world of ours, you need a massive bureaucracy that will manage all of this. A huge bureaucracy ensuring that the degrees are sound degrees, that the institutions are sound degrees, that the people granting the institutions are sound people, that the people working within the bureaucracy are sound bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. Right? This is not the same thing as authoritarianism. John Aubrey would recognize authoritarianism because he himself grew up under an absolute king and admired that king, King Charles I. This is something quite different and very, very modern, something that did not exist in his own day and age. In fact, this is so modern that Max Weber, a name we encountered already, one of the 19th century commentators on modernity, not only did he have a problem with capitalism, he also had a problem with this new bureaucratic spirit. He felt it would paper us in to such a degree that it would have the effects of a steel-bound cage. Another element is capitalism. Max Weber is right there. It is very, very much a part of our modern world. There isn't any aspect of our world that isn't somehow tied into what Marx would call this cash nexus. And this too is something that would take John Aubrey very, very much aback. Everything is up for sale, right? When you raise a family, you have to think of the economic costs involved. When you marry, you have to think of the costs involved. When you get an education, you have to think of the costs involved. When you choose your profession, you have to think of the costs involved. When we think of our entertainment, is a movie going to make money? Is this art object worth something? When we look at churches, they have to ask themselves, do we have a sufficiently large congregation that we can continue, given the fact we have to pay our way forward? In South America now, evangelism is crowding out Catholicism because evangelism seems to promise a better means of making a living than Catholicism formerly did. Again, capitalism is a defining element of the modern world in a way John Aubrey simply could not in any way recognize. Then there's the risks at large. John Aubrey was well aware of the fact that weather can be very precarious. It can cause starvation or the destruction of the invading Spanish Armada. That was something he was very much aware of. On the other hand, he would never imagine that we mere human beings have the capability of bringing about a global destruction through our new inventions like nuclear weapons, or perhaps just through our aggregate of inventions that are, it would seem to be, creating this climactic crisis that will affect everyone across the globe. That is something he can't understand. It is a very, very, very much a part of our modern template. Then, of course, there's the idea of meritocracy. Who gets to go to the top of the pyramid in John Aubrey's day? Well, sometimes you would have people coming from lower classes doing so, but for John Aubrey, the idea of virtue was very, very much contingent on the right type of family that you came from, that your genetics would push you forward in this way, not that he knew what genetics were, that the bloodline really determined whether you were dealing with someone who was of a high quality or a low quality, hence the intractability of the class system, as opposed to our own day and age where if you're very, very fast, right, or you're very, very strong, you can actually stand on the top of the pyramid, on the top of the podium, and you can win a gold medal for your efforts. Or you can climb to the top of a corporation, or you can become the top professor, our top politician, and so on and so forth. Talking of politics, John Aubrey would be astounded by the notion that our leaders were elected not just by men of his own nature. He was able to vote to some degree within the House of Commons as a member of the gentry. He could determine how finances operated in that country. He and his like-minded members of the gentry, all of very, very, very good family, of course. He would be astounded that the leader of a country would actually be chosen by the population as a whole. Blacks and Muslims and women and lower ranking people, right? The equivalent of blacksmiths today and bus drivers and the rest of it, they would have a say-so in choosing who was going to pass laws over him. This he would find bizarre, absolutely bizarre, something he could never, ever, ever get used to. And when that individual who had been given all of this power, the equivalent of multiple bombs that he could use to destroy the earth, when suddenly his tenure of office was no longer desirable in the eyes of the population, he would just relinquish it and walk away. This would strike him as unimaginable, unimaginable, oh so modern and oh so foreign from his own way of doing business. He would be struck by our individuality. He would be amazed. He would be amazed that individuals count for so much in the eyes of society. In his own day and age, in a sense, the individuals had their movements constrained because the feeling was if you give them too much latitude, they will affect the well-being of the aggregate of society as a whole. Whereas today we feel, of course, no one is allowed to break the law. You can't steal and kill, as to your heart's content. But on the other hand, the feeling is that the system is there for your personal expression and your self-exploration and the choices you're going to make for yourself. The system is there to support the individual. This too is very, very modern and something very, very off the radar for an individual like John Aubrey of the 17th century. He would be amazed to see what type of leaders we have. A Shapiro, a Jew, talking to the population at large and shaping their opinions. A black man sitting in the most powerful office of the land. A woman sitting the head of government, his own country's government at one time. Right? Unthinkable. And a Sikh sitting as a leader of the opposition or part of the opposition here in Canada. This would just be unimaginable to him. He would also be astounded by our desire to migrate and to leave behind our notion of home. Americans, he would be surprised to discover, they move 11 times in their lifetime. They leave one city, one neighborhood for something completely different, so unlike his own population, where if you were to move 10 miles from the place where you were born, that would have been considered quite extraordinary. In other words, the idea that you're going to grow up knowing everyone around you, all the neighbors, your aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and the rest of it, this is something that we have left behind. And John Aubrey would just be astounded by this. If you were to go into your cemetery in his day and age, you would see the place where your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather was buried. Not so today, right? We are atoms moving off on our own personal trajectory. Our sense of time is very different too. John Aubrey rose with the crowing of the cock. He would go to sleep when the sun set. The seasons would dictate his various movements. Not so today. We measure time's passage through the usage of this cesium atomic clock, right? And we measure it with a great deal of accuracy. And we understand that there are 24 hours in the day, that your workday in the winter is going to be exactly the same thing as your workday in the spring, the summer, and the fall. Right? None of these things change. It is marked occasionally by festivals like Diwali and Christmas, but nothing to the extent that time was broken down on a very local level for the likes of John Aubrey and his 17th century fellow travelers. Time too, because it's so different, because we live longer, but it's also so different. It affects our stages of development. For John Aubrey, if you were 18 years old and you hadn't yet found a companion to marry, time was getting on, and because you were probably going to be dead at the age of 35, you had to make up your mind quickly. If you were humming and hawing, wondering whether you were going to become a blacksmith or not at the age of 25, John Aubrey would say, well, you know something, when you do finally make up your mind, you're going to work at your trade for just a couple of years and then you will die. Unlike us, where of course we start off as babies and we pass through infancy and then we move on to our early adolescence and then our early adulthood and then we start to taper off, but we do so over a much, much longer stretch of time. And therefore, the idea of someone not knowing what they're going to make of themselves, even at the age of 25 or 30, well, that is something that is very, very modern. And the idea of starting a family at the age of 25 or 30, that too is very, very modern, so unlike the norms of John Aubrey's own day and age. There are no universal truths for the modern. This John Aubrey would find astounding. We are so rational. Look at our season atomic clock. We don't rely upon the organic creature, the crow, nor the rooster to wake us up in the morning. We rely upon items that are connected to the cesium atomic clock and that wake us up with this extraordinary, rationally driven regularity. Right? So we are surrounded by rationalism through our devices and our various institutions, but we have no universal truths. To declare now that there is God, one God, and that his Son died for our sins, this strikes us as either palpably untrue or unverifiable or absolutely false. You can't get nearly as much, you can't get nearly as much credit within a statement of that nature as you could have back in the 17th century. To say that your leader was there by divine choice, this too we think is palpably false. He's there because we put him in office and we can take him out of office. To say that there are clear-cut differences between male and female, that too would strike us as absurd. A woman can become pretty much anything nowadays, from a fighter pilot to a doctor to someone who's building a cesium atomic clock. Right? These boundaries have long been superseded. They are not set in stone as they were for John Aubrey and his 17th century crowd. Finally, John Aubrey would be very much puzzled by our indifference to the past. In his own day and age, he really felt that the population was moving into the future with their back turned to it. They were always looking at the past and wondering, will there ever be a leader, a religious leader, or a political leader as great as a Moshe, or a Jesus, or a Muhammad, right? Or a Charlemagne, or a Caesar Augustus? For him, the reference points to navigate the future were to be found in the past. The texts to consult to understand the future were to be found in the past. But sometime around the Industrial Revolution, we suddenly realized that we had so many changes coming about, so many new machines, so many new attitudes, ideologies, concept of authority, new types of laws, new possibilities, that we slowly stopped walking with our back turned to the past. We pivoted and we started walking into the future, facing it directly. And the idea that somehow, Homer's Iliad was going to give you guidance on what to do with the likes of Google or CRISPR, or navigating your technology, or understanding the differences between male and female, if there are any still, or navigating the complications of our modern economy, we have long left this behind in the dust. And once again, this is something that would strike John Aubrey as utterly mind-boggling, something that he would never get used to. So what is history? History is interconnectivity. It is, you can't have any event taking place without a multitude of factors from that day and age combining with each other, to allow this change to actually happen. And at the same time, modernity, which in a sense is an accumulation of all these historical changes that have come about over the last several hundred years, modernity is once again the state of being that is developed in which we've become accepting of this idea that there will be limitless change that will give us increases into our personal freedom, will improve our own material condition, and this will take place over a boundless landscape. The idea being, of course, that aspects of this new state of being will be the invisibility of the world. We won't understand how it works. It will be the necessity to trust different people of the world, right, because of our lack of knowledge. It will be a matter of credentialism on the part of those experts who are expected to trust, bureaucratic mechanisms that will persuade us these people can actually be trusted, as well as a realm in which we have no universal truths, a world that is capitalistically driven, and a world in which we pretty much turn our back on the past. All of these will be attributes of the modern. And with this in hand, we can move on to the next step. So much for our foundations, the definitions of history and modernity. In our next lecture, we shall see that the world has truly changed.